Hi, I'm attorney Renee Osipov with Chelle Law, and we assist parents, guardians, and students who are having issues surrounding 504 plans and the accommodations that are included in those. So in this video, I'm talking about examples within a 504 plan. So I will go through specific examples of disabilities that would qualify for a 504 plan and also accommodations, examples of those, and then also examples of where those accommodations would take place inside the educational institution. So first, let's start with examples of diagnosis or disabilities that would qualify you for or your student or child a 504 plan. So I can't actually give an inclusive list because 504 plans, specifically the eligibility for them, are very broad. So this is the federal law states, so this applies to all 50 states, that a student have either a mental or a physical impairment, and it can really be any. This is different than an IEP, because an IEP, a student has to have a disability that fits within 13 categories. A 504 plan, just any, literally any physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. So this doesn't mean that it rises to the level that the child needs to be pulled out for special education services. Again, that would be more an IEP. A 504 plan diagnosis or disability is just really anything that substantially limits a major life activity or event within the educational institution. So let's get into some examples. So first, let's start with mental impairment. So this would be depression, anxiety, OCD, ODD, ADHD, ADD, all of those things would be considered mental impairments. And again, that list could really go on. Just any sort of diagnosis that a healthcare provider can give for a child that substantially limits major life activity. So I've given you an example of the mental impairments, but let's talk about examples of how that would substantially limit them within the classroom. So this might be anxiety around taking exams. It could be anxiety around giving oral presentations. So maybe the accommodations are that they are allowed to record their oral presentation, maybe at home or somewhere where they feel comfortable, and then play that for the class. If they have anxiety around exams, maybe they're allowed to take their exam in a quiet place outside of the general education classroom, or they're given extra time, or the exam is being read to them. Also, staying on the anxiety disability or diagnosis, if the student suffers from panic attacks, common accommodation is that they are given, we could call it like a secret code or some type of cue that the teacher would know that the child is needing to self-regulate, so they would be able to leave the classroom and go to a designated area, normally for a specific period of time, so they can self-regulate. Or if they're having an anxiety attack, they need to go to the nurse's office or the office, or seek out a different professional within the school setting. So those are some examples of accommodations for mental impairment. Also, things like ADD and ADHD, common accommodations are prompts or chunking the work. So chunking the work means that instead of handing the child like a large worksheet that could be overwhelming to them and they could have a hard time focusing on the task, the teacher may chunk things together. So sometimes this looks like they just circle a couple questions at a time, and the child finishes that and then checks in with the teacher, or they are just given those questions a couple at a time, so they don't even see the full extent of what needs to be accomplished. So those are some examples of mental impairments and also accommodations for them. So then we can kind of go into physical impairments. So The important thing to remember about physical impairments and examples that I'm going to give you, sometimes those are temporary. So if a child has some type of accident, potentially, they may have a physical impairment that's going to definitely substantially limit their abilities within the educational setting, but it might not be permanent. So they could be receiving therapy or rehabilitation. But that doesn't matter. 504 plan and the accommodations can still be granted to that student if they're needed and they qualify. Physical impairments, the best example I can give you is if someone's in a wheelchair, they would need clear access to go in and out of the classroom and move around a desk. Maybe they need a specific desk to sit in, or they need to sit in a specific area. Transitional times, maybe they need additional time in the hallway transitioning between classes. If they have a locker, perhaps the locker would need to be modified in some way so that they could access it, or does that child or student need an aide to help them with the transition between classes? All of those are examples of physical impairments and then how they would be handled. Now, I gave the example of a child in a wheelchair, but perhaps the child just has difficulty walking. Maybe they need some type of aid to walk. So then those accommodations would be modified to meet their needs. Also, fine motor skills. This is another one. So if a child potentially has difficulty with fine motor skills, so they can't write things out, accommodation would be that they could speak into some type of like dictation software, or they could use a keyboard or some other way to communicate their writing with the teacher as opposed to just pencil and paper. This can also, the accommodation could be lended to exams as well. So maybe they could dictate either to technology or to an aide who then would write those answers down for the teacher to grade. So those are all examples of physical impairments. So we've got examples of diagnosis, what their accommodations would kind of look like. I'm going to give you some examples of poorly written accommodations and accommodations that I think are superior, in my opinion. So a superior or the best practice for writing accommodations is to make them extremely clear to anyone who would pick up that 504 plan and need to use it. So what I mean by this is if a substitute teacher comes in, other staff, maybe specialist teachers, so physical education, art teachers, they're coming into the classroom or the students going out, can they implement those accommodations and know exactly what they mean? So for example, if a child is given extended time on an exam, how much extended time? Is it double? Is it triple? Is it a specific period of time? So they're just given an additional 20 minutes. It needs to be written clearly so that whoever the educator is or staff would know how to implement that accommodation. And it's not disruptive to the child or to anybody else in the classroom. An example of a poorly written accommodation would be just extended time on an exam. We don't know how much time. Can they actually spend all day on that exam? Can this time go over into other subjects? Things like that. That's a poorly written accommodation. Another poorly written accommodation would be, let's say a child has an anxiety disorder and they feel a panic attack coming on. And the accommodation would be written that the child would have to raise their hand and ask to be let out of the classroom to go to their special area. In my opinion, that's a poorly written accommodation. The student now has to disclose to everybody in the class that they have a disability. It disrupts the class and it disrupts the student themselves because now they're going to be worried about disclosing this to the whole entire class. So the same skills as other students, so it would need to be accommodated to meet their needs. Again, I say this in a lot of videos, the forgotten area really is the cafeteria. And I use sensory processing as well, but also students who have physical disabilities as well. Cafeterias are loud, smelly places. A lot of times, unfortunately, students only get like 20 minutes for lunch, and that's going through the line to get their food, sitting down, eating, and finishing. And it's stressful to them. and there's a lot of people moving around. So if a child has sensory processing issues, this is going to be really overwhelming for them and can lead to outbursts or behavioral issues. So accommodation may be that they are able to sit in a designated area which has less stimulation, or they're allowed to eat in a different area completely so they don't have to stay in the cafeteria. If the child has a physical impairment, they may not be able to physically walk through the line to get their food and sit back down at the table, so accommodations would need to be made. Or they can do this, but it would take them more time. So the accommodation would be that they receive additional time, or they were allowed to eat lunch first. So they they leave to go to the cafeteria 5 or 10 minutes before the other students. And then also going to and from school. So are they provided services on the bus? And then lastly, extracurricular activities. So if a child with a disability would like to be on a basketball team, cheerleading squad, debate team, any sort of extracurricular activity, do they need services within those areas as well? So the thing to remember in this video, because I gave a lot of examples, but there's so many more because every child's needs are unique. Every educational environment is unique, and every disability or impairment is unique to that student. So the great thing about 504 plans is that the possibilities really are endless. And educators and parents and 504 plan teams can get very creative when drafting these accommodations so that the child has a specific accommodation to meet their specific need, and so that they can really succeed in an academic setting. If you have any questions, or you would like help drafting accommodations, or just to kind of conceptualize what accommodations might be needed, we definitely have services to meet those needs. Our contact information and our website, everything is in the description below this video, and we are definitely happy to help.